today we're going to start off learning about how to shoot in manual. I just think that's the most important first step, how to actually work your camera instead of just letting it choose for you. I'll tell you, like, I refuse to shoot in manual forever. I'm like, why? Why bother putting in all this effort, happening to have it not turn out possibly? But I'll tell you, the one day that changed is my first big family session. There was like 35 people, and I was shooting in, mostly auto is on the Aperture priority, because I was just really into Aperture, I guess. And I kept checking the back, you know, when you look at the back of your camera, and it all looked like good and bright. But I went home, and the grain was like huge, like you couldn't even see people's faces. It was so grainy. I was like, why did this happen? And I freaked out. I had to redo their session.
Right.
So I had to learn.
You're like, okay.
And it turns out my camera, you know, it just picks whatever it thinks the settings should be, and it picked a really fast shutter speed and a really high ISO. So I had no idea, and it freaked me out. I'm like, you know, you blow up big family pictures huge. I'm like, this isn't, it's not gonna look good.
Over the fire
So,
and it's pixelated, you're like, ooh.
so that's one reason why to learn to shoot on manual. Another reason is just to, you know, interpret your own artistic way, because you can shoot the same scene and have it look totally different. Like, have you guys seen those pictures of like waterfalls where the water looks like silk? And you probably like heard that before for your shutter speed. I have a picture on page 2 here. So this in the middle, based on shutter speed, you can make a picture look totally different. And have you guys seen, I just put this one on there because this is something I really want to do, is with the still wool. It's just like, kind of like a sparkler, I guess, but like crazy. So like, you know how you'd see that in person, it's just like a sparkler. But like with the long exposure, it looks like something completely different. So you can be artistic and, you know, make things look how you want them to look. So we'll just get into it. So shooting in manual is just about exposing properly, I guess. Making sure it's not too bright or not too dark. And on this first page we have the exposure triangle. So it's all about balancing these 3 basic settings and making them coordinate with each other. So we'll start off with Aperture. This is my favorite thing ever. It's the funnest thing to play with. So Aperture is the opening inside of your lens. So this little thing here, you can see how it's like, they have these little shutters that like click together. So if you're shooting wide open, like they say, in a really low aperture number, then it's wide open, and you're letting in more light to touch the sensor. As well as what that does, you're letting more light in, but also you can see this picture of the little flower here. You know, that creamy bokeh background that when you look at people, like, usually that's what you think. They look professional if they're doing this. It's because they're controlling their aperture. So that goes along with how shallow your focal plane will be. Does anyone know what a focal plane is? So you can see this little guy, how he's got a tripod and he's shooting a wolf over here. And basically a focal plane would just be if this was cut up into chunks. So these, in between all of these would be like a little focal plane. And you can see in the first one, he's got a very wide open aperture. So everything's pretty blurry except for his little tiny focal plane. And that's why you get a blurry background and a blurry foreground, depending on what you set your aperture to.
Exactly.
Alright, so let's move on to shutter speed. This one is pretty easy to grasp because I'm sure you've all taken a picture of your kids where they have like crazy blurry hands everywhere.
Right.
Picture. So you can either have super fast if you're doing sports and it'll freeze them in motion. Or you could do super slow like that waterfall and have it look like creamy goodness. So just different, whatever you are trying to shoot is what you want. So shutter speed and aperture together determine how much light hits your sensor. So I try to adjust these 2 first before going to ISO, which we'll talk about. So the ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the visible light. It's more like a computer-like aspect to it rather than a physical. So once you've adjusted your aperture and shutter speed exactly where you want it, and you can't change them anymore, that's when I would adjust the ISO.
And with the shutter,
So there's that. So if you've set your aperture and your shutter speed and they're exactly where you want it, the next thing I would adjust is ISO. If your picture is too dark, then you're going to want to raise it. But general rule of thumb is I try and keep it at 100, always. Because the higher you go, and depending on your camera model, you'll get super grainy pictures. I think we've all had one of those, at least with cell phone pictures. They are always usually pretty grainy, right?
and that's
So
why, like, photographers gotta do it.
this
like,
is the basis. As long as you learn how to shoot in manual, you can learn anything. Because this is the hardest thing to learn.
This is the
But
part
the
that
only way to
makes
do it
difficult.
is just to do it.
To do it, yeah.
If you do one full photo session, or like go out, take your kids for an hour, and just make it a goal, only shoot on manual, you'll be so much better the next time.
Right.
And just all you can do is practice. And last page, this is kind of turned out blurry how we printed it. It's just on Pinterest if you ever want to look it up, but
Pretty vintage.
kind of goes over everything of like the same stuff. But mostly I wanted to show you on the bottom. Have you seen in your cameras how there's this little meter? So everybody turn on your cameras right now. And you'll notice if you, let's see, do any of you have a top display? I guess just me and Jen. But either way, if you look in here through your lens and you kind of wake up your camera, there should be this little meter that's jumping around in the middle. Have any of you noticed that before? It looks like this with some number values, and this little dot in the middle kind of jumps around based on what you're pointing your camera at. So the goal with all of this, setting your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, is just to get this little point to be at 0, because 0 should be perfect lighting.
Yeah, that's